Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the most complex and honestly, most enduring geopolitical puzzles in the modern world. We're taking a journey to understand exactly how a unified peninsula, one with literally centuries of shared history, fractured into two radically different states. This isn't just dusty history. It's a living, breathing reality that is actively shaping global security right now. So get comfortable because the story of the Korean Peninsula is absolutely fascinating. To make sense of where things stand today, we've got a clear historical roadmap. We're going to cover centuries of unified history, the 1945 division, the devastating war, post-war divergence, and finally, a new hostile reality. Section 1, Centuries of Unified History. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds. Before 1945, there was no North or South Korea in any political sense. For centuries, this region shared a common language, a deeply rooted culture, and a unified identity. Back in 1392, the Joseon dynasty began, and they governed for over 5 centuries. Fast forward to 1897, and amid some pretty intense mounting pressures from regional powers like China, Russia, and Japan, the Korean Empire was officially proclaimed. But that independence, short-lived. By 1910, Japan formally annexed the peninsula. This colonial era lasted until 1945, and it heavily transformed Korea's administration to serve the Japanese Empire, which of course sparked diverse resistance movements. Now, a really vital piece of this puzzle is how the colonial period actually physically shaped the land. The Japanese colonial economy created vastly uneven development. Heavy industry and hydroelectric power, those were intensely concentrated up in the north. Meanwhile, the South remained predominantly agricultural. Without anyone really realizing it at the time, this uneven infrastructure laid the early physical and economic groundwork for the massive regional disparities that would eventually define the divided Koreas.
Section 2, the 1945 division.
So, 1945 is the pivotal year here. Following Japan's surrender at the end of World War II, external forces rapidly and artificially fractured the peninsula, changing its destiny literally overnight. Now, what's really interesting about this is the number 38, the 38th parallel. After the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan in August 1945, American planners quickly proposed this merely as an administrative line to accept Japan's surrender, while making sure Seoul was included in the American zone. It was never intended by the US to be a permanent international frontier. It was, quite literally, just a line drawn on a map. But that line very quickly became a hard reality. In the northern zone, Soviet forces supported communist and left-wing organizations, elevating a guerrilla leader named Kim Il-sung. The authorities there rolled out land reform and nationalized industries. Simultaneously, over in the southern zone, the United States Army military government governed directly. This southern administration faced widespread strikes and uprisings, which resulted in the severe repression of left-wing organizations. So right from the jump, we are seeing two entirely different economic and political systems taking root on opposite sides of that parallel. Section 3, the devastating war. By 1948, two rival states had been formally established, with both claiming authority over the entire peninsula. The failure to form a single national government led directly to conflict. But the build-up to the war involved some highly complex, behind-the-scenes geopolitical maneuvering. Step 1. Kim Il-sung repeatedly sought approval for an invasion of the South. Step 2. Joseph Stalin initially rejected this in 1949, but conditionally approved it in 1950. Why the change? Well, the strategic environment had shifted, specifically because of the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War and the Soviet Union finally acquiring an atomic bomb. Then Step 3. Wanting to avoid direct conflict with the US, Stalin told Kim to consult Mao Zedong. Mao subsequently gave his reluctant consent, offering Chinese assistance if it was needed.
The resulting war was an incredibly chaotic, tragic back and forth. In June 1950, North Korean forces launched a full-scale invasion. Then, by September 1950, UN forces supporting the South landed at Incheon and pushed north. Fearing a North Korean collapse and American-led forces right on its border, China actually intervened in October 1950, pushing the lines right back down. After millions of military and civilian deaths, the fighting finally ground to a halt. In July 1953, an armistice agreement was signed by the UN command, the North Korean army, and Chinese forces. But notably, South Korea was not a signatory to that agreement.
So, the crucial point is this. Organized hostilities ended under the 1953 armistice, but no comprehensive political peace settlement actually resolved the conflict. This is the absolute core of the issue. The war ended without true peace, leaving the two Koreas technically in a prolonged state of suspended animation, a state that persists to this very day.
Section 4. Post-war divergence. In the decades following the 1953 armistice, these two states drastically evolved away from each other. Central to North Korea's post-war trajectory is a specific ideological foundation. Juche is an ideology promoted by Kim Il-sung that developed gradually from the mid-1950s and is commonly translated as self-reliance. This ideology really became the guiding principle for the state's internal operations and its relationship with the outside world. Looking at their political evolution side by side reveals a pretty stark contrast. In North Korea, leadership passed down through the Kim family, combining socialist institutions with hereditary leadership. They faced a severe crisis in the 1990s known as the Arduous March famine, a multi-causal tragedy that involved the loss of Soviet support, economic mismanagement, and natural disasters. South Korea, on the flip side, went through its own painful evolution. Following decades of authoritarian rule, which oversaw rapid industrialization but also severe political repression, like the suppression of the 1980 Gwangju uprising, the country experienced massive mass protests in 1987. And those protests ultimately forced a transition into the competitive, multi-party democracy we see today. Now, a major factor in their modern divergence is the nuclear context. North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006. Today, the North Korean government portrays its nuclear arsenal as permanent and non-negotiable. However, as our source material strictly points out, it's absolutely crucial to understand that this is their stated position, not an objective fact or some unchangeable law of nature.
Section 5. A new hostile reality. And this brilliantly illustrates where we are today, because we are currently witnessing a massive modern-day shift in relations that completely alters decades of established policy on the peninsula. At the end of 2023, North Korea announced a fundamental reversal of its reunification policy. Following through on this, throughout 2024, they systematically dismantled institutions that were historically associated with reunification, actively moving to redefine the relationship with South Korea.
The result of this policy reversal is this sobering fact. North Korea now officially treats South Korea as a separate, hostile state. I want to be very precise here based on our sources. While this policy reversal is perfectly clear, the complete wording and the legal implications of the related constitutional changes are not fully transparent. Because of this, we cannot claim that this stance is permanently irreversible, but it is undeniably their official posture right now. So we're left with a really jarring reality when we look at the peninsula today. South Korea continues to define peaceful unification as a core constitutional objective. North Korea, however, now defines itself in direct opposition, strictly as a separate, hostile state. We have two nations sharing one peninsula, but operating with entirely incompatible systems. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly difficult question to ponder. Knowing that organized fighting ended way back in 1953 without a peace treaty, what would a comprehensive political peace settlement even look like for two states with fundamentally incompatible systems? It's a geopolitical knot that just continues to challenge the world. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.